Welcome to the Leadership Secrets Podcast, where we bring you no BS, practical advice from the experts that are doing it. Now, here's your host, Lee Lisenby.
All right, welcome to the Leadership Secrets Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I have as usual, I have a guest on this episode. Kind of partial, as you know, to manufacturing. I've always had manufacturing people on, and I don't know if that's always the right answer, because I know a lot of my listeners maybe not in manufacturing, so they want to learn more about other industries. Lesley Holloway is a lawyer she's managed a law firm for the last 6 years. Crazy thing about her intro that it's hard to believe. She has 90 plus employees, but 45 direct reports. That's the most I've ever heard of. So Lesley is definitely a leader who is doing it. And as we talk about a lot on here, this is the No BS podcast. We're not bringing you consultants and coaches to talk about doing it. A lot of people talk about doing it, but very few are actually out there doing it. And Lesley is one of those who are actually doing it. And she's from the great state of Texas, which is even better. Lesley, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you being on. Your story is very inspiring. We got into your story quite a bit last week. I can't wait to share it with our audience here. And I know we're going to get a lot out of it. But if you don't mind, just kind of go through a little bit about you, what you've done, what you're currently doing, some passions maybe of yours.
Yeah. So, as you said, I manage a law firm. It's a personal injury firm that I have managed for the last 6 years. I've actually been with the firm for 15 years, started just as a regular associate and sort of worked my way up. And I am really passionate about mentoring attorneys, which is something that's really hard to find in the legal field. A lot of attorneys in the more senior level think when they hire new attorneys, it's like, well, you're a lawyer, so figure it out. And they're not really interested in mentorship. So that is my passion, is trying to help young attorneys find their role in the legal world, become better attorneys, have a great reputation as an attorney. I think that's important. And so that's something I work on a lot at my firm.
Yeah, we talked about that last week a little bit. Really, and when you reached out to me originally, you mentioned you subscribed to the Leaders Eat Last, I guess, philosophy. I don't know how she put that, which is one of my favorite books. I love that book. I think there's so much value in that book. It kind of got me started on my personal development, professional development habits. Just curious, can you explain kind of like why did you put that in that message? What's your thoughts on Leaders Eat Last? Sorry, I can get that out.
Well, I think that I've always sort of subscribed to that philosophy. And then when I found that book, and really all of Simon Sinek's philosophies that he puts out there, it really resonated with me. I started my very first job at age 13, which was maybe not legal at the time, but I was waiting tables at a really small little restaurant in my hometown that was a deli and a hardware store. And, so I came from sort of a customer service type background. And I think that the idea of Leaders Eat Last just sort of jumped out to me, coming from that customer service industry and, waiting tables pretty much all the way through law school. The idea of being sort of service to your staff, to the people that you're supposed to be leading. It's just a personal philosophy I've always had. So when I found that book, it really, really resonated.
Yeah, I tell you, that book came around right at the perfect time for me in my career. I was in the military, and Simon Sinek wrote a lot of that book about examples from the military. And I never really thought about it in those terms, how because Simon can put things in the best the best stories, the best way. I mean, it's just man, it's powerful how he writes. And I was in a company that decided to not allow the frontline employees at Christmas parties. They said it was too risky. It was only going to be the managers at the Christmas party. And I was thinking back to my military time and how the Christmas party was all about the officers serving the enlisted and thanking the enlisted for all they done throughout the whole year. And it was one of the most powerful moments because I was a junior enlisted person, kind of climbing the ranks, and to talk to the CO, the XO, the my division officers, all these people who were powerful in our command. It was a magical moment for me. And then when the CEO of a company tells us we're no longer allowing anyone but managers at the Christmas party, I was like, then right then that Leader Eats Last book came out. I was like, this is perfect. And I think more people could get. I think a lot of people should read that book, if not everyone who's in a leadership position. So one of the things we're big about on this podcast is personal development and really habits around personal development. Do you have any personal development habits?
Sure. Well, I'm a mom of two, so it is challenging to carve out time for oneself when you're working full time and mothering full time. But I do have a habit. I walk every single day, and that's something that I just don't compromise on. So typically, my morning is really rushed, getting the kids ready for school, getting them out the door. But I walk them to school, and then I just continue on with my walk, and I make sure I get at least 2 miles a day. And during that time, I usually listen to either podcasts or an audiobook.
Yeah.
So it's kind of my time for both physical and mental development. And I just have to be efficient about it because I don't have a lot of time and a lot of hours during the day. But I really think that physical development in the morning in particular is important. And I got that from Bonnie St. John, who I heard speak at an event. She's a former Olympic skier, and she talks about resilience. And she actually lost her leg as a young child, and she's got a fascinating story. But anyway, she talks about just 10 minutes of exercise in the morning is enough to sort of kickstart your brain, get the juices flowing. And so
Yeah.
I've always taken that to heart. And so, getting that physical activity, particularly when you're at a desk job where you're sitting most of the day, super important for me to keep that habit and keep it consistently.
Walking is great. Like I love morning walks. I don't do it all the time, but when I do, I feel like the mornings is so much better. Because you got through in nature, it's just peaceful. I don't know, your whole soul feels better when you get back, I feel like.
Yeah, I agree. And it's good to get it done first thing in the morning too, just so that your day doesn't get away from you.
Yeah. It's not so hot there in Dallas area.
Right, right.
Get pretty
Yeah.
hot in the afternoon here. Oh well. So by the way, like moms who have kids who work jobs like yours, I just so impressed by that. And there's a lot going on. Like I feel bad for my wife because she has a job as well, and it's so much to do, like all the time. I try to help here and there, but she's so much better at it than I am. But that's pretty inspiring that you still have time for that. How about so you mentioned podcasts when you're walking. Do you have any other like professional development habits? I know you're a lawyer and you got a lot of stuff on that end of the spectrum to do.
Well, as lawyers, we're required to do continuing legal education. So I have to do that every year. And it's 18 hours, it includes ethics. So I have to not only keep my legal skills up to date, but I also really believe in sort of constant growth and learning. I really try to teach my kids about having a growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset. In I'm telling them when they say I can't do this, I'm always like, well, you can't do it yet. So it's real important to say that yet, so they have this idea that they can grow and learn. And I feel that way about my own personal beliefs and my own brain. I feel like it can still grow. It doesn't matter, how old you get. You still can learn. You still can learn new things. Maybe not not as easily, or your neuroplasticity in your brain isn't quite as adept as a child. But I really believe that we can constantly keep learning. So yeah, podcasts are a great resource because you can get a lot of information in a short episode. But I also really, audiobooks are a big thing for me, just because I can listen when I'm doing my walk in the car. I love to read, but as a lawyer, you're always reading. So sitting down to read a book is sort of cumbersome at the end of the day. I always say I'll never need Ambien as long as nonfiction exists, because it just will knock me right out at the end of the day. But no, audiobooks I think are a great resource. So I usually listen to books on not just leadership, but sort of all different areas. Particularly the study of just humans and how we work.
I'm glad you mentioned audiobooks. That's the only way I consume material. That and podcasts, I guess, and YouTube videos. But I struggle with dyslexia. I wrote about this in my one of my LinkedIn posts once. But I was a D student through like third or fourth grade. Just struggled, and still to this day, I cannot sit down and read a book. I mean, I can if I have to, but I get so distracted because I have probably ADHD along with dyslexia. But man, audiobooks, I wish I had it when I was a kid. It's like you're saying, you can fit it in like in the gym, you're walking, your vehicle. There's so many different ways to consume it. But so you came a managing partner 6 years ago. Uh, how did that go? Were you provided any kind of training? I'm sure there was some sort of training to go along with that, but were you taught how to be a leader, or did you teach yourself that end of it?
So yeah, absolutely not. I got no training. I got, no guidance, except for the examples that have been set for me. And I learned a lot of what not to do from some of the people that had come before me. Um, I think that is a big gap in the workforce. I think you've talked about this before. You just happen to be the person that's good at the job,
Mhm.
and you get moved up because you were good at the job. And so that doesn't necessarily make you a leader. Uh,
Right.
you work hard and you outwork everyone, which is pretty much what I feel that I did. I had to do a lot of advocating for myself to get my leadership roles. But, once I got there, it was like, okay, here's the role. And what are you going to do with it? So I had to take a lot from my background in customer service, which I think was really helpful. When I was working in restaurants, I was a trainer. So I think being in leadership roles there sort of helped. And like I said, I learned a lot of what not to do. And then I just made a lot of mistakes along the way. And I think that you can't be afraid to do that. Um, and then I just, started consuming information about leadership
Yeah.
and learning about it, really.
Okay. Wow. I think that's such a common example that I've seen. Is that I know we fell at it all the time in companies I've worked at, and I really had to take ownership on a lot of that because I'm the one who's putting these people in management positions and then training them how to do the administrative side of work, but not how to lead a team of people. And sometimes I assume people are like you, that they're going to consume the information, the material, and self improvement, but that's not always the case. Uh, so you're super busy. I can just imagine how busy you are. Like you're totally like you amaze me just by some of the stories you told me, all the stuff you got going on. But as far as productivity, because I feel like a lot of new managers, especially, struggle with time management. Do you have any productivity hacks or ideas or help or advice maybe you can give new managers?
Well, I'd say for first and foremost, when I get to the office, the first thing I do is I leave my phone in my purse. And I know that sounds really simple, but the phone is such a distraction to everybody these days. And so, first half hour, I don't even look at my phone. I leave it in my purse. I read somewhere that for every time you pick up your phone, it takes you about 2 to 3 minutes to get back on track.
Yeah.
So just having that distraction is a huge productivity hindrance.
Yeah.
Um, so I definitely leave it in my purse. I try to work in sort of 20, 25 minute bursts too,
Yep.
where I'm just really focused and then I can kind of give myself a mental break. I don't think, people just can't grind away for hours and hours. As much as we'd like to think that we could, our brains just can't do it. And so, sitting at a desk job like I do, I try to really focus for a short amount of time and then give myself a little mental break. The other thing I do is I work better with a little bit of brown noise, and I know a lot of people have heard of white noise. I don't know if you've heard of brown noise. It's sort
Never
of
heard of it.
similar. It's got a little more bass to it, so it's
Okay.
more like a river or something. But studies have shown that it increases your focus and can increase productivity. So I just like a little bit of brown noise in the background sometimes. I think that really helps. For people with ADHD, they've talked about it really helping people who suffer from that. So I think that just a little bit of that noise can kind of help me focus a little bit more.
That's the first time I ever heard of brown noise. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, you really should. I had always I my kids sleep with white noise, and they have since they were babies. It's just something that they tell you to do as a new parent, and so we always implemented it. But then I ran across the idea of brown noise, and it seems to work well for me. So I would definitely suggest that as a productivity hack.
Okay. I'm glad I asked that question. Sometimes I skip that question because it's kind of an awkward question, and some people don't really know how to answer it. But brown noise, it might be a game changer for me because I definitely struggle there. So is my oldest son. He's as bad as I am with ADHD. Uh, so your career has been. I mean, I don't know how old you are, but you look very young, and to be in this position you are right now with managing 45 direct reports is incredible. But managing a law firm, a pretty big law firm at that. But I know with success comes failure, and with failure comes success. Can you give us some maybe examples of failures and how you overcame them in your career?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm 42, so I don't have any qualms saying that. I think it's a blessing to age. So after losing my parents, I very much believe that. And yeah, I have definitely failed in a lot of ways. So I think my biggest failures usually come from communication issues. It's not that I don't want to communicate, but sometimes getting so wrapped up in the day to day, or trying to rush through and find that productivity, the communication side of things just sort of suffers. Um, I can think of one example primarily. I tend to not take action on problem employees soon enough. And I think that is probably my biggest fault as a leader and as a manager.
Yeah.
Um, really getting that feedback from other employees, because you have to listen to other employees who see someone who's not being productive or not carrying their fair share of the load, because that makes other employees resentful. So if they see somebody who's slacking, who's not doing their job, who's on their phone, who's taking personal calls, um, they become resentful because they're doing their work and this person's not, and it affects the entire team. So I think I had an employee one time, and I had some people coming to me and saying, well, she's on her phone, she's doing this, and I really wanted to be procedurally correct, and like, okay, we need to catch her on the phone, I need to do corrective action plan, I need to do all this, and I just drug it out too long, and a lot of the other employees got resentful. So I should have really addressed that situation quicker,
Yeah.
and really jumped in and been a little bit more aggressive about that, because the other employees were suffering because I wasn't doing that. So
Right.
really a lack of communication on my part. I've always heard, fire fast, hire slow. But I feel like, you know, firing someone's just the worst. I never relish that. And so I'm kind of constantly looking at ways to rehabilitate someone in the workplace when perhaps I shouldn't. Perhaps they're just not a good fit for that particular job. Um, and so, that's probably where my biggest failures come from is the lack of communication and the lack of, taking action once employees are communicating with me that someone's not carrying their weight.
That's the hardest one to do too. I mean, that's I think a lot of us. I know I've failed there many a times in the past. That's a tough one. But you're right. You get what you accept. So if you accept, low performance or whatever it may be, or breaking policies, I mean, that's what you'll continue to get. And
Yeah.
it's so hard. I always try to be too good, too nice to people. Not it's not that I'm not nice as a person. I don't like conflict. So that's a struggle. Glad you
Yeah.
mentioned it, though.
Yeah.
So most of our audience is, I would say, new leaders or frontline leaders. That's kind of where we spend most of our time. But if you were to give any advice to a new leader, what would it be?
Well, I would say definitely start educating yourself and start looking for resources that can help you on this journey, whether that be leaders that you admire, that you've known, start reaching out to talk to them, a former boss that you really enjoyed working for, and, just reach out with a quick email and say, hey, I just got this new leadership role. I could really use some help. Um, you know, I think like we mentioned before, podcasts are such a good resource now for people. There's so many great ones out there. Um, One of my particular favorites is Work Life with Adam Grant. He's an organizational psychologist, and he sort of studies different companies and really gets into their culture and why their successes work. And I think listening to that, these are totally different fields. They're not related to the law. But for me, just hearing some of the things that other people do that make them successful is really inspiring for my own organization. So I would say new leaders definitely need to start looking for those resources, whether it be people, books, podcasts. Um, just don't think that you can do it on your own from your own internal resources, because that's usually not going to be successful.
Yeah. I've never seen a lack of people wanting to help if you reach out to them. I've never had a time in my career anyway that I was struggling and I reached out and someone wouldn't help me. So there's always people there. It's one team, one fight. And so we're all in it together. So
Yeah, absolutely.
it's a great answer. So you mentioned a little bit about books, and we're big about reading books. I always recommend books to people. I have two hard copies of two books. I actually interviewed this guy. I haven't posted the podcast yet. Jim Hewling, The Four Disciplines of Execution. He was on my show last week. And this is my all-time favorite leadership book. It's Your Ship. I think I'm biased because I'm former Navy, but I think the lessons in here is extremely powerful. But I also have some other books I recommend, mostly John Maxwell books. But if you were to recommend a book or two to a new leader to read from the very beginning, maybe a new leader, let's say, what book would that be?
I initially want to say really anything by Simon Sinek because he's so great, Start with Why or Leaders Eat Last. But I think also you have to be willing to look at books that aren't necessarily about leadership, but are more about people and how people work. Because as you've mentioned, a lot of people write books on leadership, but they're not doing leadership. They're not actually dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. So I like to read books. One that I just finished that I love was Quiet. It's about the power of introverts in a world that can't stop talking.
Okay.
And that's an amazing book because it's really talking about the dynamics of extroverts and introverts and how we need both and how both are successful. A lot of leaders of companies think Steve Jobs, introvert. So a lot of people that end up in leadership CEO type roles are not necessarily extroverts, even though that's sort of what society prizes. So I like to look at books like that just to, think about the ways that people are different and how we can get the most out of the people that are on our team. The other book that I really like is a book that I just finished actually called Humor Seriously. And it is about having more humor in the workplace. I think that it talks about bridging the gaps between gravity and levity. And just because we're doing serious things doesn't mean we have to take ourselves so seriously. Um, a study found that leaders who use humor are 27% more motivating. So,
Wait,
and
say
the
it.
leaders who use humor are 27% more motivating. And the two ladies that wrote this book, they teach about using humor in leadership at Stanford. And so it's not a field that you would think really coincides with leadership, but I think that it's important to look, sort of outside the box, I guess, when we're talking about how to become leaders. So for all the Simon Sinek, for all the, Sheryl Sandberg lean in sort of books, I think that you also have to balance that with books just about the way that people work, because that's really what you're trying to get as a leader. You're trying to get to how people work and how to get your environment to be conducive to not just one type of leadership, right? Everybody's got different personalities. So it's really getting the best from each person.
Gotcha. Do you read much fiction?
I love fiction and I don't really read much of it anymore. I think the last one I read was The Martian, which I
Yeah.
think was a movie with Matt Damon. The book was great, by the way.
Right. The Martian, yeah, that was good. That was a good movie. I've never read the
Yeah.
book. So you mentioned introvert and extrovert. What would you classify yourself as?
I think I'm an ambivert. I think I'm a little bit of both. um, Obviously, my background is in acting. And so I think that I certainly don't mind getting on a stage. But what's interesting about, introverts and extroverts is it's not necessarily about shyness. Barbara Streisand, for example, terrible stage fright. So it's more about whether being around people energizes you or whether it drains you. And so for introverts, being around a big group of people or being, immersed in sort of a seminar for a few days, it's going to be exhausting to them and they're going to need time to sort of recharge their batteries.
Right.
Whereas extroverts get really excited by that. They're like, they love being around people. It really energizes them. So that book really gives you a different perspective on what it means to be an introvert and an extrovert.
That was the book Quiet.
Quiet. Mhm.
Okay. I gotta put that on my list. I don't know why, but I always falsely assume this, but I see highly intelligent people like yourself, and I assume they're an introvert, but that's not always the case.
Well, I think that that book just gives such interesting perspectives. But, I think that intelligence, it doesn't necessarily have to do with being extrovert, introvert. Some interesting things about introverts, they actually did studies on their skin and they're actually more thin-skinned than extroverts. Something like 90% of them are. And then they studied babies and they did things like pop balloons in front of them. And the babies that were highly reactive to those sounds and noises, those end up being the introverts
Right.
uh, versus being extrovert. So it's just sort of fascinating, the whole concept of it. So it's more about sort of reactions to the outside world dictate whether you're going to be an introvert or an extrovert, at least from early on when they're studying humans. So yeah, intelligence, I think is one aspect, but I think that it's more like your sensitivity to the world.
Yeah.
So good to know when you're managing people.
Yeah,
Right.
sure.
Right.
Have you ever done a DISC assessment? DISC?
I haven't, no.
It's like, well, it's kind of like a Myers-Briggs, but you're classified as a D, I, S, or C. D is being like a dominant driver personality. I is influencing, which is like the life of the party type person. S is stable, steady, which is like the best employees because they're always there, always reliable. And C's are compliant, but they're like data driven. Like they're afraid of being wrong. But there's a lot of, I mean, it's so simple on the outside of it. If you describe it like that, but you get into the assessment, it's like 32 pages long, and there's so much information there. I can send you a code. I'm a DISC consultant, by the way, so I do a lot of these and debrief people on them. But once I saw mine and saw my wife's, I automatically understood. Like, I wish I had this the first day of marriage, because I've been trying to change her. She's been trying to change me this whole time. And now we're like, wow, we were just wired completely different. And it's how we communicate. The whole DISC assessment is about communication skills and how we communicate with one another, but also kind of our fears and our blind spots are in there as well. But
Well, I would love to do that. And along those same lines, I would recommend Gretchen Rubin and her 4 tendencies. She does a 4 tendency quiz, and it's about how you meet inner expectations and outer expectations. And I have used that one in work as well. And so it talks about upholders who can meet inner and outer expectations, obligers who readily meet outer expectations, but they have trouble meeting inner expectations. They have questioners who are going to question all expectations and will meet expectations once they're satisfied with their questions. And then they have rebels, and rebels just push and resist against all expectations. And interestingly, you mentioned your military background. She went and talked at West Point, and she expected at West Point that she would be speaking to a group of upholders. And surprisingly, the only upholder in the room was the teacher, was the commander, and the entire room was filled with rebels.
yeah.
And rebels are typically usually the smallest group of people, but where they sort of present themselves is in the military and in the police. And her theory is that rebels they want structure and rules to sort of push against a little bit. So it's good to know about that sort of thing also when you're managing people. Like, what kind of person am I getting? Am I going to get a questioner and I need to satisfy their questions in order to get them to meet my expectations? Am I going to get a rebel who's going to want to push back a little bit? Do I have an upholder who's just going to meet expectations no matter what? So
what were you?
So you would think, I get a lot of people that guess that I would be an upholder, but I'm actually an obliger.
Okay.
And so I readily meet outer expectations, but have a harder time meeting inner expectations. And I think that's maybe because I prioritize outer expectations over my own inner a lot. So I will, make sure everybody else is sort of taken care of first before I come to myself. But then that sort of goes back to that leaders eat last sort of philosophy as well. So. Right.
Yeah, I think you'd be an S on the DISC assessment too, maybe an SC, because they combine the letters as well. So, man, I think I would definitely be a rebel. For whatever reason, I fit very well in the Navy. Like, I was like a poster child in the Navy, I think, but not so much outside. Maybe that's. I mean, what was that again?
It's the 4 Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin.
Tendencies. It's something you can take online?
Yes. She's got a 4 tendency quiz online.
Okay, 4 tendencies. I'll take it now. All right, you mentioned Adam Grant in his podcast, Work Life, and there's we talked about Simon Sinek, and by the way, I think Simon Sinek has been mentioned on every episode so far. I only have like 8 episodes or 9 now, but I think everyone has mentioned Simon Sinek, which is one of my favorite authors. So it's fun talking about him. But is there anyone else out there that maybe you follow on social media or podcast or YouTube that's sharing a good message that we should tune into?
I think, like I mentioned before, Sheryl Sandberg, she's great, especially, as a woman leader, which is a little bit different.
Yeah.
We kind of come with our own set of problems and issues and strengths. I mean, everybody does, but she's great. Brene Brown, she's got a lot of great messages that she puts on Instagram, and she's got her Dare to Lead book. So, as a woman, I do like to listen to these women leaders and sort of get their perspective as well. Um, so, I think little snippets from Brene Brown, everything she says, I feel like is pretty inspiring. And she's not just, for leadership. She's also great with parenting and relationships, and I mean that's about a lot of what being a leader is about relationships and how you relate to people. So I think that is really good. The other person that I really like is Sean Aaker, and he wrote a book called The Happiness Advantage. And that's, again, something sort of atypical for, what we're talking about with leadership. It's not leadership per se, but I think when you're talking about personal development, his book on The Happiness Advantage, it just sort of gives you a different perspective on what happiness is. And I think if you have a better understanding of that, as a person, you want your people that are coming to work to be happy. You don't want them to come to work being like, I hate my job, I don't want to be here, and sort of let's look at happiness in a different way. It's not just always reaching for this goalpost, because if you look at happiness as sort of always, if I get here, then I'll be happy. If I get here, then I'll be happy. Then you're never going to be happy, because once you reach that goalpost, it's like, okay, well, now what? So, he talks a lot more about the process and relationships, and he's got a TED Talk that's really great to listen to. So, I think, understanding yourself is a key to being a good leader as well. And so his book was really helpful for me in that respect.
Yeah. I've definitely seen that book. I don't think I've read it, but I know what you're talking about. You mentioned something really quick, and you don't have to answer this. I'm curious because you mentioned the difference between leadership for men and women. And I know most of my direct reports it's probably 50-50 men and women, and it's been that way my whole career. Can you dive into that a little bit? What do men need to be aware of, or what are the differences in your minds when it comes to men versus women in leadership positions?
Well, I think, gosh, we could probably do a whole series on that.
Back up, start recording again. Let's start over.
But I just think that women sort of feel differently about how they approach leadership than men. Obviously, there's a lot of history between men and women, and women in particular, I think you are concerned about coming on too strong and how that's going to look. You don't get the same sort of, a man's being, an authoritative type of personality, and she's just being, awful to everybody. So it's sort of like, okay, well, I need to be a leader. I need to be strong. I need to be firm, but I also don't want to come across too aggressive, because that's going to be looked on badly. I mean, women are sort of kind of constantly picking themselves apart, I think, in ways that men are not. And I don't know, because I'm not a man, but I just feel like there's also sort of still in the legal world, especially, something about just by the virtue of being a man, you are automatically sort of given authority, whereas as a woman, you have to really work and earn it. So, and and you would not think that's the case in 2022, but it's still there, definitely. I've had to work for my position, whereas we had partners at my firm that aren't there anymore because they, didn't work out, but they did not have to work for the role in the same way that I did. They were just automatically given the role. And it's like, well, you are an attorney, you're a man, then you must be fit for this position. Whereas I had to go and advocate for myself and say, listen, I can be a great leader, I can be a great partner. I think I deserve a seat at this table. And I really had to have that conversation, whereas they did not. So I think that that is something, that's just still out there in the world. Women have to be, advocate for themselves more, um, and sort of figure out our own style of leadership. You shouldn't lead, like, I can't lead my organization the way that my partner led me.
Yeah.
He led me in a different way, and I come from a different generation that, you know, was definitely more do what I say. I expect my employee to jump when I say jump. And he had this different way of leading the organization than I have. And I think that my leadership style is definitely more conducive to what we're seeing now with the new, generations coming in with millennials, Gen Z entering the workforce. They definitely wouldn't respond the same way to my partner and how he bossed me that I did. So, I think women have a lot of strengths. It's just a lot of them, a lot of women are new to leadership roles, particularly in larger organizations. And we have to play to our strengths for sure.
Okay. Man, you said a lot of great stuff right there. That, I've never even thought about it because I'm pretty aggressive. I mean, I don't know if in a bad way, but I'm the D in the disc. I'm a dominant, so I'm always like I'm full steam ahead all the time. I don't even care what people think most of the times, which I probably should more often. But I can imagine if I put myself in a woman's shoes, I probably could be seen a lot differently. And those are the things that it's good to hear those kind of things.
Well, I think as a man, you have to think, how am I going to get the best from my female employees, and approaching them the same way that you approach a male employee may not be successful. And
Yeah.
so, there's no one size fits all when it comes to leadership. I don't think you can say, well, I'm going to lead my team this way and everybody just better jump on board. It's the same with how do I approach an extrovert versus an introvert? How do I approach a male versus a female? Because at the end of the day, if you want your company to be successful, you want to get the best out of all the people there. And so you might have to rethink your approach to women and what they respond to versus men and what they respond to.
Right. Right. So I'm thinking about my direct reports. I have 16, not nearly as many as you, but I think it's pretty evenly split, 50-50. It may be like, 7 versus 9. I'm not really sure, but I know when we meet, I mean, I love the diversity just because the women's ideas and details behind certain initiatives, whether it's changes or improvements we're making. I mean, their inputs are, I think, as valuable, if not more valuable sometimes, because I don't think about in those terms all the time. I make decisions without a lot of data, and a lot of times I think, just looking back on it, they probably keep me out of a lot of trouble in terms of a lot of those type stuff, just because they have the details. My wife always tells me I never read instructions, which I never do, and she's always the one reading their instructions. Like, where's your instructions? I was like, I threw them away. I don't have. So,
I think sometimes stereotypes exist for a reason,
oh
and
yeah, they do.
that
Yeah,
is pretty stereotypical.
I'm very stereotypical, but we have to have that. I mean, like I'm saying, I think I've been bailed out more by women in my career than men just because of those type of things. But that's a stereotype again. I want to think all women are that way, but
Right. Well, I think it just goes to show there's room for both. There's
Right.
room for people that are big picture people, and there's room for people that are detailed oriented. And, whether that's, that men tend to be more big picture and women tend to be more details, that may be stereotypical because it's not the case for all in either of the sexes. But yeah, there's definitely room for diversity on teams because it gives you that different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So this kind of end of our podcast. We it's a leadership secret podcast, so we're always asking the last question: is the leadership secret? And basically, the leadership secret is what are great leaders doing that other leaders aren't that should be. So, what are the small few of the great leaders doing that others should be doing? And kind of want to get your take. Do you have a leadership secret in that regard?
Well, I think that just being authentic, I think showing your human side, showing your failures, talking about your failures openly is really important. I think too many leaders think, well, I have to be perfect and I have to set this perfect example of what leadership is. And I don't think that your team or your organization is going to relate to you if you don't show some of your authentic self. I remember it wasn't long after my dad had passed, and I was really struggling with that grief and sort of spinning a lot of plates all at once with work and with my kids and, dealing with all of that. And I just blew it. I
Yeah.
messed something up. And I was just beating myself up about it. And I really, I just put it out there. I wrote a big long post, and I don't usually share a lot of personal stuff like that on social media, but I'm just like, today I failed. I failed with a capital F, and
Yeah.
um, I got such a huge response to that from people, more so than I think anything I've ever posted in my life. Normally it's a lot of just, here's my kids, or here's a dog, or and
Right.
I just sort of put that authentic piece of information out there, and I got such good feedback because I think that's what people want to see. They want to see that you're human. People look at me a lot and say, oh, you've accomplished so much, or you've done this and that. I mean, I've also had a lot of failures, and I think showing people that you're imperfect can get that sort of response as a leader. Look, here's how I've messed up, and here's what you can learn from it so you don't mess up. I'm happy to share those stories with my team, with my lawyers. I've given them anecdotal evidence. I told them about my first trial where I just completely messed up when I was picking a jury and totally didn't ask the right question. A big part of our model in personal injury is about pain and suffering. And I did not ask one question about pain and suffering to any potential juror. I just completely blew by it, which is a huge mistake on my part. And luckily, the defense counsel came in behind me, and when he was questioning the jurors, he asked about it. And I was just like, oh my God, why did I not ask this? But I tell my young attorneys about that because I want them to know, look, everybody messes up. It's how we respond to it. It's how we, um, you know, what we learn from it.
Yeah.
I think that's important. So I think being authentic as a leader is really important. And I think that's what really great leaders get right.
They do. Yeah, it's great advice. I mean, I just thought so many examples that you're saying that because I've never thought about it in those terms, being genuine and authentic. I mean, obviously, it's part of it, but I mean, not so much that it's sort of forefront. You don't really read about that a lot in leadership books, I guess, but that's so true. I was thinking about, I've only released a few leaders in my career, and some of them that I had to release were the ones that weren't that way. They're the ones who maintain this image that everything was going great, and then they didn't want any help from anybody else. And honesty and being genuine is a good piece of that. Well, Lesley, we're to the end of our podcast. Where can listeners follow you, find you? Do you have a social you out there you want to put out, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Instagram. That's probably my biggest one. I'm at Lesley Aaron 29 on Instagram. I I do want to say I have a scholarship that I created in honor of my dad. It's called the Curtis Holloway Memorial Scholarship, and it's for kids who come from single parent homes. I was raised in a single parent home, so if you just Google that, or Curtis Holloway Memorial Scholarship on bold.org. If you know someone that wants to apply, that's closing in September, but I am going to redo it for the next year. So it's a great scholarship for kids. If anybody is moved by that story and wants to donate, you can also donate to that scholarship fund. And then, if anybody ever has leadership questions, I'm always willing to help. And you can email me at leslie.holloway@benabbott.com, BENABBOTT.
Okay. Excellent. That scholarship, so it's for single people who grew up in single family homes. Is it for any type of degree, or is it specific to degrees?
It's for people who are going to a 4-year degree.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's not specific to law or anything in particular. Just somebody who's pursuing a 4-year college degree. My dad helped me a ton when I was going to college and law school, and I'm just trying to give back. And scholarships helped me a lot as well. So just trying to do something to honor his memory.
Okay. Can I leave that in the show notes, the link to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, perfect. Well, thanks so much, Lesley, for being on. You shared so much wisdom and dropped a lot of bombs here, so I appreciate that. I'm so glad you're on this episode, and look forward to catching up with you down the road.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right, thank you. Have a good day.
All right.
Thank you for tuning in to the Leadership Secrets Podcast. Please join us next time as we bring you more leadership secrets from the people who are actually doing it. See you soon.